Hi, everybody. I arrived in southern Afghanistan in the fall of 2001 to a place called Camp Rhino, a former hunting lodge used by Osama bin Laden. It was a big brown structure in the middle of the big brown Afghan desert, and to me, I felt like I was in the middle of nowhere, and I really was. We arrived with a number of other reporters on a military prop plane under cover of darkness to avoid the detection by Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. I learned later this was taken as a precaution to minimize the chances that the plane might have been shot down. When we landed, we were herded off the plane into utter darkness, the only light, the ambient light from the moon and the stars of the big, beautiful Afghan sky. But the wash from the propellers and the sand and the dirt and the noise and the craziness created for me a sense of total chaos and danger. We were not in Kansas anymore. This was my welcome to Afghanistan. It was in many ways my introduction to being a journalist covering the military. My curiosity, though, as a journalist covering the military did not really start out that way. I'm a Corning boy. I did not grow up exposed to that many aspects of military culture, pomp and circumstance, deployments to war zones, boots and short haircuts. In fact, the peculiarities of military culture were lost on me. I would learn later that Marines avoid eating a certain kind of hard candy because they're convinced it will bring them bad luck and they could literally be killed on a mission, so they don't do it. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I wanted to travel the world, work for a big newspaper, and tell stories about a foreign culture and explain that foreign culture to folks at home. My life didn't quite work out that way. I found myself kind of mid-career as a journalist, working for a military newspaper nobody had ever heard of, writing about something I really didn't care about. But 9/11 happened, the world got scarier, but for me, it got a lot bigger. I suddenly was going to places like Afghanistan and Iraq and North Africa to cover military operations. And I started to have a better understanding for what the military was and what it was about. And I realized that that foreign culture I was hoping to cover as a correspondent so far away was in many ways right here at home. American military culture is as foreign to most Americans as any other. Now, as a military journalist, I'm not a cheerleader for the military, I'm not a defender of the military, but I do see myself sometimes as an explainer of the military in my job. So I wanted to talk about today, briefly, was my experience as a journalist covering the military, and about what I see as a bit of a divide between the nation and that military. The nation is war-weary and less interested in foreign affairs, and thus not as interested in what the military does, is, and represents. The military is increasingly drawn in from itself even after all these years of war. Also want to just kind of touch on this idea that we build walls around ourselves to kind of reinforce the ideas that we're familiar with and kind of keep out those things that we're not. And my kind of cheap metaphor for the day is like a military base that has high walls and fences and gates. Kind of all Americans keep things in that we're comfortable with and keep the scary things out. So a couple of quick anecdotes about my experiences as a reporter. As I say, we got to Afghanistan. We were later taken to a place in southern Afghanistan called Kandahar. It was a civilian airport, kind of a bizarre place, baby blue civilian airport designed by the Russians. Looked like something out of the Jetsons, these big floor-to-ceiling windows. And it was essentially a base of operations for all the U.S. military operations there in the days after the 9/11 attacks. There were some dangers that lurked on and around the base, to include Russian mines that had been placed all around. And I remember one day walking along with a military officer who was schooling me in how to, avoid these dangers. And he was explaining to me about the mines. And I said, as we walked along the runway, how do we know that there's not a bomb right here beneath our feet? And he said, we don't. And I realized at that minute that we were facing just a fraction of the kinds of dangers that folks who we pay to put on the uniform and go confront those kinds of dangers every day. A few years later, I was embedded in Iraq with Marines in 2004. And at the time, the military strategy was to win the hearts and minds of the Iraqi people, thus creating security and stability on the ground there. And after a patrol I was on one day, I wanted to go talk to a Marine Lance Corporal about what he thought about this. Now, a Marine Lance Corporal, as you may know, is a junior enlisted Marine, in my view, one of the most colorful of the junior enlisted rank structure. It's upon their shoulders that almost anything the military does rests, and they always have kind of an interesting perspective, colorful perspective about the world and their role in it. So I went up to this guy and I said, well, what do you think about winning the hearts and minds of the Iraqi people? And he looked at me and he smiled, he patted his rifle and he said, sir, 2 in the heart, 1 in the mind, and I get to go home. I said, buddy, you just won the quote contest today, and I jotted down what he said for my story. When I tell that story to a military audience, I often get kind of knowing laughs because they recognize the kind of unfiltered candor of a Marine Lance Corporal talking about his job. When I tell that story to some civilian audiences, I get gasps and groans because it reinforces to some what they think they know about the military as kind of an unthinking killing machine. My view is that the truth is somewhere in the nuanced middle, that Marine probably lost buddies on the battlefield. He knows there's bad guys out to try to kill him and his friends every day. But he also knows how to exhibit the discipline he needs to pick up the rifle or not pick it up and not shoot it. Completely different anecdote. A few years ago, I wrote about a secret Pentagon plan to defend the nation against a zombie apocalypse. It was a legitimate plan assembled by military academics to just figure out how to manage a potential pandemic in the US. And they used zombies as kind of a colorful way to illustrate the point. Well, reporter's dream, my story went totally viral. Cable news networks, other magazines, newspapers all picked it up here and around overseas. What it pointed out to me was, one is everybody loves a story about zombies. But it also reinforced this notion that the military, which in this case the nation pays to be the ultimate planning organization and has to think about all these things all the time. On one side, but a public naive to this sometimes, thinking the military's just completely whacked out, that they're sitting around thinking about how to defend the nation against a zombie attack. Few thoughts about perceptions of the military by the American public. Unlike journalists who literally do rank beneath used car salesmen in terms of integrity and honesty, military generally enjoys pretty high approval ratings by the American public. They are the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts of our culture, seen as ethical and patriotic, certainly, integrity, can-do spirit. They're kind, clean, and reverent. But what's interesting about American support for the military is it's sometimes viewed as not going very deep. So a case in point would be a parent who's confronted with the decision to support their son or daughter's choice to enlist in the Navy, the Army, or Marines, or whatever. Any military recruiter will tell you he or she's had this conversation with these parents 100 times. Parents are quick to say, yes, I support the military, but send somebody else's kid into war. There's a fallacy in the notion that 9/11 brought the nation and the military closer together. Americans were quick to slap, yellow ribbons on the trunks of their cars, support the troops. Folks were called out at ball games when they came home to much fanfare. Americans went up to soldiers in airports and thanked them for their service. But these were seen as relatively thin shows of gratitude by the military, which perceive Americans to not really take the time to really understand their culture or their service or their sacrifice, especially when many Americans are perceived to not have had much sacrifice themselves when it came to fighting these wars. On the other side, though, military, in many ways, you could argue, is more insulated from the rest of the nation it defends. It's, if you consider the folks who serve, who consider in some cases their service in the armed forces as the family business, because 80% of those who serve are already connected to the military in terms of having a brother or sister, mother or father aunt or uncle who've also served, which is also great. But what it suggests is a very interconnected island of people isolated from the rest of the nation. These people also see themselves differently. According to one poll that was taken last year, 63% of those who serve in the military think of themselves as more patriotic than your average American. Completely stands to reason, but what's concerning, I think, about it is that people see that and they think folks who serve in the military not only think of themselves maybe as differently, but potentially think of themselves as better or even privileged or entitled. There's a number of roots of this divide, but one contributing factor is when we ended the draft as a nation in 1973, we ended what one congressman referred to as a national egg beater that funneled folks from all backgrounds into national military service. We now have what's called the all-volunteer force, but which relies on a dwindling number of folks who serve in the military. Fewer now than 1% of Americans serve in the military. That's relatively, you could compare to the height of World War II, where it was like 8 or 9%. Totally different set of circumstances, but nonetheless. I would throw out there that there's a couple concerns that you could consider when you have a nation that's disconnected from its military and a military disconnected from its nation. A couple things. One is, I think that nation is more inclined to fork over resources to that military because it defers some of that power. So when the military wants a $130 million jet or 300 copies of that jet, it gets it. When the Pentagon asks for billions of dollars in personnel benefits to fund and recruit and retain a force, it gets it. Nobody wants to say no. Note that as recently as the 1970s, 3/4 of those who served in Congress had a specific military background. Today, that's closer to 20%. Again, nobody wants to say no, and it's easier to say yes when members of Congress or just the nation as a whole has less skin in the game, and it's the military that has more potentially at stake. Also, we maybe fork over kind of unwittingly more decision-making power to that military to help us just make decisions because, again, we don't have as much connection or knowledge to it. There's one more reason I would say that you need to think about caring. The more disconnected we are, I think, from our military and vice versa, the more inclined we are to send that professional warrior class into conflicts that we maybe even don't support, don't understand, and probably even worse, feel like we have the luxury to forget. Quick anecdote, I know a guy who's a senior Army officer who got orders to go to Afghanistan sometime last year. He lives in Washington, D.C. in a reasonably informed neighborhood, and he knows his neighbors and he's lived there for a while, but they all expressed concern or surprise that he was going to Afghanistan because they said they didn't know that we even had troops still there. There are, for the record, 10,000 troops there, and just even as we stand here today, 2 of them were killed today, and as many as 15 hurt in a blast. I just leave you this one thought. We are, a world full of divides, right? Socioeconomic, racial divides, political divides. You can accept my premise, or if you do, that the nation is divided from its military and vice versa. That's great. For me, I learned that asking questions and kind of listening for the answer, I was able to become a better journalist and maybe even a better citizen. And I don't want to sound self-righteous about that at all, but that was how I experienced it. I think that whatever the divide that you may confront, whatever it is, I would just urge you to ask questions and nurture the curiosity. listen for the answer, and maybe you will not tear down the wall, but hopefully you can open the gate. Thank you.